Welcome back to Introduction to Writing Philosophy. This is Lesson 2, Choosing a Topic. So this lesson will teach you how to choose a topic that you can write a philosophy paper on. By the end of this lesson, you should know some of the topics that other philosophers have written about, understand what makes a topic relevant to philosophy in the first place, and be able to apply some strategies to help you choose a topic that you can write a paper on for this course. If you're wondering whether a particular topic would make for a good philosophy paper, ask yourself these questions. Is this controversial? Meaning, is this something that people could disagree on? Can I take a stand on this issue? Meaning, can you formulate a clear position on the topic? Can you hold to a particular view that differs from views that other people might hold? And finally, is this something that can be argued for, that needs to be argued for? Is this something that can be settled through empirical inquiry alone, or is this something that requires a reasoned argument to actually settle? Basically, a topic should be something that you can ask questions about, hold a view on, and make an argument for. To make this even clearer, let's take a look at some examples of topics that philosophers have written about. We'll start with topics that are inherent to philosophy, topics that form the basis of some of the major sub-branches of the discipline. Recall that last time we talked about how one of the things that separates philosophy from other kinds of writing are the kinds of questions that philosophers ask and the kinds of problems they investigate. We call these questions and problems abstract because resolving them requires us to look beyond what we can just observe or measure with our senses. They are the sort of questions and problems that we have to reason about and debate about. Now, different branches of philosophy, different areas within the discipline, can be grouped together and separated from one another, largely based on the kinds of questions that each area tends to focus on. For example, metaphysics involves questions like, what is the nature of a thing? For instance, what is the nature of reality? What is the world fundamentally made of? Epistemology, the philosophical study of knowledge, asks questions like, what counts as knowing? How do we know that we know something? What does that actually mean? And is it possible to know anything at all? Generally speaking, metaphysicians and epistemologists deal with descriptive claims, claims that describe what something is, claims that describe a thing according to a particular definition or interpretation. But other branches of philosophy tend to focus more on prescriptive claims, claims that prescribe a particular way of thinking or acting. And ethics and aesthetics are two such examples. So ethics deals with questions like, how should we act? What makes something right or wrong to do? Whereas aesthetics deals with questions pertaining to beauty. What is beauty? How should we evaluate whether or not something is beautiful? Whether or not something is worthy of being judged in that way? Now, these are just a few of the major branches of philosophy. This list is not intended to be exhaustive. Furthermore, each of these areas of philosophy encompass additional topics. For example, metaphysical investigations might give rise to questions pertaining to free will, to the nature of consciousness, to notions of identity. Epistemology may invite questions pertaining to truth, to defining what makes a claim true or false in the first place, to distinguishing the difference between knowledge and belief. And the same could be said for ethics, aesthetics, phenomenology, existentialism, basically any branch of philosophy. So now that we know a few of the major branches of philosophy, let's take a look at some of the topics that are not necessarily part of philosophy itself, but could easily give rise to philosophical questions and debates. As we've seen, certain topics are inherently philosophical. Epistemology, metaphysics, ethics, these are a few examples of those. But other topics can give rise to philosophical questions, even though these areas of study may not necessarily fall under philosophy itself. For example, fields such as science, history, and religion can easily give rise to philosophical questions when we abstract from the fields themselves. So in other words, we may ask questions about religion, about history, about science, from the perspective of philosophy. If you're interested in writing something on a philosophy of X, you might consider questions like these. What are the boundaries of this field? In other words, what makes this field distinct from others? What are the aims of this field? What do people working within this area strive to accomplish? We could also ask what is possible in the first place for this or that field to accomplish. We might ask whether the aims of some particular field are even attainable. A couple of examples of this kind of work might include Kant's critique of metaphysics, Marx's critique of philosophy, or Alasdair MacIntyre's critique of the social sciences in his book After Virtue. We could also ask, what is this field supposed to accomplish? What should it be trying to do? So independent of whatever those working within a given area might say about their own aims, a philosopher might ask whether there is something that the field ought to strive to do, what they should be doing, or alternatively, what it should not strive to do. A secondary question that we could ask might be, what is the role of this field in society? What should its role in society actually be? And a good example of that kind of work might be W.E.B. Du Bois' analysis of the social role of science. So these are some of the philosophical questions that we could ask about virtually any field you could think of. But whenever we're talking about the philosophy of X, it's important to understand that for any field you want to analyze philosophically, there are bound to be problems and questions that are special or unique to that particular field. So, for example, in the philosophy of religion, you have questions pertaining to the nature of God. You have the problem of evil. In the philosophy of history, we might ask who should be considered an authority on the history of a people. And in the philosophy of science, we see people debating on topics like the role of value-ladenness in the scientific process. What role do values have in science? What role should they have? Should they have any role at all? A few other topics that are ripe for philosophical exploration might include public policy, education, work, gender, race, entertainment, issues that concern society and culture. The point to take away is this. Basically, there are very few topics that cannot be explored through a philosophical lens. It all comes down to whether we can ask questions about them, whether or not they are controversial, and whether or not we can argue for a particular view. If you can do that, then your topic is probably relevant to philosophy. You can write a philosophy paper about it. So let's say you have a topic in mind, but even after all this, you're still not totally clear if it's relevant to philosophy or not. Maybe I didn't mention it in this video, maybe you couldn't find a project about it, maybe you've never heard of anyone else writing philosophy on the topic you're thinking about. Like I said, there are very few areas that are not somehow relevant to philosophy or that can't easily be made relevant to philosophy if we do some tweaking. But if you're still having trouble, here's a couple of suggestions to help. Pick a topic that you are passionate about and give yourself permission to be as broad as you like, because we can always narrow it down to something more specific later. Try to reflect on why this topic is important to you. Does it touch on some deeper value that you hold? Is it something that you've been studying for a long time and are particularly knowledgeable about? Is it something that you think has an impact on the way that you or other people live? Finally, consider if there is anything you would change about the way that other people talk about this topic. Are there views that people hold on this particular issue that you think are incorrect or maybe incomplete? Is there a popular way of viewing this topic that you happen to disagree with? What do you think it is that you're seeing that other people are missing?